Ruthless Compassion is a podcast that shows you how to become fiercely kind. I'm the host, Dr. Marcia Sirota, and in each episode, I get into it with experts and regular folks about the things that get in the way of what we want. Things like addiction and mental health, isolation and loneliness, difficult family and work relationships, and the importance of self-care. I want to help you overcome the obstacles to living your best life, and I want to inspire you to become a powerful kindness warrior. Welcome, Jowita Bydlowska, to the Ruthless Compassion podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's really, really exciting to have you here today because I think your topics in general are very, very important, especially the topic of shame. But before we get started, I always like to get my guests to kind of give themselves an intro, to sort of talk about who they are, where they come from, how they got to here. And that kind of gives the listener a little thumbnail about you from you.
Sure. Yes. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be doing podcasts. And I'm a huge fan of mental health. And so just sort of going back, my first degree is actually in psychology because I wanted to do what you do. And then I quickly realized that I was not very good at separating work from sort of personal life. So I switched to journalism and became a writer. I published my first book at the age of 35, I think. English is not my first language, so I always like to say, because a lot of people want to write books and they think there's a lot of obstacles. And I'm like, if I can do it, most people can do it, because I learned English as a teenager and, and I ended up writing in it mostly to be able to communicate with people because I wasn't fluent. I didn't know any, words, and writing helped me to do that and helped me to write stories. And then subsequently, from the age of 35 till now I'm 48, I've published 5 books under my name and 4 books as a ghostwriter. And most of those books deal with mental health in one way or another. The 2 memoirs I have, this is my latest one, it's called Unshaming. So both of these memoirs definitely touch on addiction, recovery, and the latest one is very much inspired by the topic of shame. So this was originally was supposed to be a very straight nonfiction investigative journalism on the topic of shame. That ended up being a memoir, and I can explain why. But a lot of it is research based, mostly, from psych info and studies, and less so interviewing people. But I really like a lot of psychological theories, and I like what they have to say about shame. And if you ask me, I'm probably not going to remember any of them, but it's all in the books.
Okay.
So I'm a writer for a living, and I've been very fortunate to be able to do it almost strictly for the past 12 years. I teach and I mentor as well, but writing is my passion and my job, and it's not magical at all. I just sit down and work. So, yeah.
I love to write too, actually, and it's definitely a passion of mine as well. So I
Yeah.
totally get it. I totally get it. So I wanted to start with your story
Mhm.
because I think getting to your new book on shaming really is kind of a moment in time in your story, right? From becoming a mother and
Mhm.
your issues with addiction and then where you are today. So in your own words, can you just tell us the story of your
Yeah.
drinking and your mothering and your sobriety and your relapse and your sobriety?
Yeah. I mean, it was, so like I said, I wanted to write about shame. And one of the things I was really struggling with was being able to say some sort of definite thing about shame, like other than what psychological theories tell you, like toxic shame versus healthy shame. So I think I was looking for an expert or a bunch of experts. And at some point, I realized that I'm the expert on shame, having
Mhm.
been someone who had, relapsed into drinking after giving birth to a baby boy, and then writing about it and being very public about both my addiction and my recovery. And then also living this very troubling life, like a double life that I had, because I believed myself to be sort of responsible for other people's recovery, especially my readers, people who have read Drunk Mom and it became a bestseller. There's a movie based on it. I still get letters from readers. And I was a hypocrite because the reality was that, in private, I was relapsing. Sometimes I would have a year or 2 of sobriety, sometimes a few months, but it was an ongoing struggle. So I thought, if I'm going to say anything about shame, I should talk about my own shame, that of essentially being someone who's lying publicly. And whether that's in my head or if it's publicly observed thing, it's inconsequential because, as you know, shame is very internal. So I internalized that sort of duality to the point that it became crippling. And then, yeah, so I mean, addiction was ongoing. I also thought a lot about recovery and how we tend to see recovery and how we prefer to see it, which is sort of a, I was bad or I was struggling, then I had some sort of breakthrough, now I'm sober and I live happily ever after. And doing what you do, as you know, this is not the story of most people, because whether it's recovery or any sort of recovery, it doesn't have to be from addiction. It is ongoing. It is, you constantly learning and you failing and you're doing it over again. So with this book, it was, there's a subtitle that my editor came up with. So it says, a memory of recovery, relapse, and what comes after. And then we scratched out recovery just to be sort of tongue in cheek about it, but also to talk about something that, like, I also struggle with the concept of failure versus success. So failure is, you do something and you fail at it, and then you try to do it again and then you fail at it. And so I added up all my relapses and I came up with number 20. This is just a, made up number, but it's probably less or it's more. I don't know, but at least 20 times I relapsed. And I really struggle with that number. And I struggle with the sense of failure, with the sense of shame, until the point where I thought, I failed 20 times, but I also had hope 20 times. And that's what really turned things around for me. And I thought, I may not have the story of recovery, but I have a story. And that story is a story of hope, which, I would argue that it lies very close to like stupidity and risk, but it is a very driving motivation to accomplish all kinds of things, including like taking charge of your own life. So, yeah.
Absolutely. So, what have you learned about shame in this journey? Because obviously that this is something that you've spent a lot of time with. So,
Hmm.
what were your takeaways?
Yeah, I think the biggest one was that it was quite simple, like the word unshaming, because I was trying to find a word opposite of shame, and it's not shameless. Shameless means something else, but unshaming means sort of stripping yourself away from shame, and how you do that is through sharing, and that could be, in a very safe environment, like with a therapist. I'm a huge believer in therapy and getting help from like outside, but you can also share your shame in any sort of safe space. And by sharing it, you tend to make it smaller, right? Because like once it's out, it's no longer sort of hanging over us, and there's less hiding, there's less, yeah, there's just less of that sort of shadow of shame like being around you. And I try to examine to see like how did I get from the point of like living in shame almost constantly. And the story that that I begin the book with talks about my accident and how I lied to the doctors about what happened because I didn't want to tell them that I was drinking because I believed I was this publicly sober person, blah blah blah, all that stuff. But how do you get from that point to the point of like not necessarily a recovery even from addiction, but like an internal recovery from shame? And it was through talking, or my very basic sort of point of unshaming was talking to my dog, which comes sort of later in the book. I get this little Chihuahua puppy and I'm all alone, and my son is living with his dad because he's had enough of my transgressions. My partner's away. Friends and family have no idea what's going on, and I have this little tiny creature that I just whisper the word please into its ear, and it's, in a way, it's tiny, but it's enough to sort of break me out of that, that confinement of the prison that I sort of imposed onto myself. And later on in the book I talk about how I eventually learned to share it in a Zoom meeting, AA, and where I finally come out and say what my biggest shame is, which is that I'm the author of a very popular addiction and recovery memoir who has relapsed. And I say this in a very safe, very welcoming setting. And it turns out to be so much smaller than what I thought it would be. Like, I just thought people would, denounce me, cancel me, like, turn their screens off, and everyone says, welcome, thank you, and, come closer. So, and I just want to say too, because like that's the takeaway is, we share our shames. I also want to say that not all shames are safe to share. This is why I'm really big on therapy, because there are certain shames that other people put on us and that are just not safe to, talk about with people who love you and who know you. And I'm sure you know that very well. So I'm curious, like, what you think too about shame. Like, what's your
Well, I think that sometimes we get into addiction because of shame.
Hmm.
I think that we carry wounds from our childhood of, wounds from neglect or abuse or exploitation. And then we develop all this shame. And then we feel worthless and undeserving and, like failures. And so we feel so terrible about ourselves that we get into addiction to numb those horrible feelings. And then the addiction reinforces the shame. So we start out by feeling ashamed. We get into addiction. The addiction makes us feel more ashamed. And
Yeah.
then it creates this vicious circle of shame and addiction and addiction and shame. And it's very hard to stop the addiction because we don't feel like we deserve it because we're so full of shame that we feel like, well, I'm just garbage.
Yeah.
I don't deserve a good life. I don't deserve sobriety. So,
Hmm.
a lot of it is being able to unshame ourselves while addicted, right? Being able to say, I am an addict and I don't have to be so full of shame.
Yeah.
So that to me is my take on it from my experience as a psychiatrist.
Yeah, and I love
Yeah.
that you say deserve because I don't use that word, because I'm probably still in that language and that mentality that word is not in my vocabulary yet,
Yeah.
One day, I hope. And what you say, I this is like brilliant. Like I start this book with a little quote from the Little Prince where he goes to the drunkard planet and he says, "Why are you drinking?" The little prince asked. "To forget," replied the drunkard. "To forget what?" inquired the little prince, who was already feeling sorry for him. "To forget that I'm ashamed," confessed the drunkard, hanging his head.
Yeah.
"What are you
Yeah.
ashamed of?" inquired the little prince, who wanted to help. "Of drinking," concluded the drunkard, withdrawing into silence for good. So that's exactly what you just said. Like
Yeah.
this cycle that's vicious. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, the other thing I learned is that people who have especially substance use
Hmm.
issues, and even food, like
Yeah.
eating, drinking, drugging, these are the people who are shamed the most for their addictions. And these are the people who really deserve the most compassion because they're suffering so much.
Hmm.
They're suffering from whatever wounds drove them to addiction. Because I've never met a person who is a serious addict who doesn't have early life wounds. It's the wounds that drive addiction. I wrote a book called Never Diet Again, which
Hmm.
is actually, it was published in 2012, and it was about how addiction is really coming from trauma, unhealed wounds, unmet needs, and our dysfunctional responses, and how then the dopamine system kicks in and it becomes a physical addiction too.
Yeah.
But I think that, these people who are having this eating, drinking, drugging addiction are full of woundedness.
Hmm.
And then society says, look at you, you drunk, you druggie,
Hmm.
you bum, you fat person. And then these people are not only carrying this internal shame, there's all this external shame where people feel perfectly entitled to shame you
Yeah.
for your addiction, which is simply the expression of your wound. It's
Yeah.
just the manifestation of your woundedness. And so it's like, you're showing them a cut on your arm and they go, contempt. They shower you with contempt for this bleeding wound that you're showing them.
Yeah.
And to me, it's so crazy how our society responds to addiction. And it's because of their own shame. It's because of everyone else's shame about their own vulnerability and their own
Hmm.
lack of tolerance for their own unhealed wounds,
Hmm.
unmet needs. We don't accept ourselves, so how can we accept the addict?
Yeah. Yeah. There's a refusal in like to see others, to like we all want to be seen, obviously, and addicts are probably people who are seen the least, I like to say like where I live in Toronto and I walk on Queen Street, there's a particular corner where there's people who are all suffering from substance use and they look disheveled and, unkempt, dirty, etc. And I remember walking by them, and I talk about this in Drunk Mom a little bit, walking and feeling a little judgment and wanting to be away, especially with the, baby carriage, and thinking, again, this is crazy because the only thing that separates me from them is just like one more bottle of vodka. Like, obviously metaphorically, but not necessarily. Like, these are all mothers and sons and siblings and full human beings, just like we are. They just look differently because, yeah, their wounds are right there for all of us to see and we ignore them. Yeah, it's brutal.
Yeah, so to me, it's, I love the idea of unshaming because it's not just for you yourself to unshame
Yeah.
yourself, it's also for all of us who are looking at you to see you as a full human being and to not put our own projections onto you, not to
Mhm,
judge,
mhm.
not to have contempt, and, to have our own self-compassion, which enables us to then have compassion for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
So you wrote this book, Drunk Mom. How old was your little one when you were writing this book?
So I wrote it during my relapse because I had this ambition to be a writer, and I published some short stories. I went to journalism school. So I was already a writer, and I thought, oh, I have this great idea for a novel about a sort of, I call her an ordinary villain. Again, this is like another thing that goes head in head with addiction is denial. So this is the extent of my denial, where I'm telling myself, oh, I'm writing this novel about this woman who drinks with a baby in tow. Meanwhile, I am literally this person. So I'm not sure when I started writing it. I would say he was probably, I don't know, 6 months old, and I was already drinking by then. And I'll tell you, the denial was so extensive that when I went to rehab, I truly believe I was going there to research for my novel. And I don't know if I sort of told myself this to make it like less shameful than just to say, I'm going there because I need it, because I'm dying, and this baby is also, getting harmed by what I'm doing. No, I went there with a notebook, with a pen, and I sort of sat around and I took notes, and I absorbed some of the, wisdom and the therapy, but I thought I'm removed from all this. So that's sort of what happened with Drunk Mom, which worked for me really well, because when I did get sober and started sort of writing it, making it into a full manuscript, I had a lot of notes. So I had notes, I had that journal, I had like, and it's hard to have notes when you're blackout drunk, like, let me tell you. So, but I did have them because I was, I probably had some degree of workaholism, but I was very diligent about my writing. Yeah, and it was my agent who asked me about this book and what was the inspiration, and I said, well, listen, like, it's kind of based on a true story. And he said, like, how much of it is based on a true story? I'm like, all of it. So, we had a quick discussion about turning it into a memoir, and that came with all kinds of other trouble, but ultimately a really good thing.
Well, also, I think as an artist, what you want to say, right? Do you want this to be a novel, which you can keep at arm's length from yourself, or do you want it to be a memoir where you're really being vulnerable
Yes.
and you're saying something quite different?
Yeah. And that was, yeah, it was a very interesting time, like when I published it, and I talk about it in Unshaming a little bit, because I published it in 2013 when we were not very welcoming of addicts. And especially, you take the most sacred possible, like, event in human life, which is childbirth and motherhood and, innocent and pure, and you combine it with the dirtiest thing that can happen, which is, addiction and blackouts and, frankly, child neglect, and then you put the two together, like, no one's gonna like hug you. And I've had, there were a lot of reviews that happened, didn't talk about the book, didn't talk about the prose. They talked about me as a person and what a, terrible person I was. And in fact, I said hug because I remember there was one line in particular that said, meeting Jowita Bydlowska, nobody will want to hug her after reading this book. But it was very telling of its time because, it was the time of Britney Spears shaving her head, Lindsay Lohan being photographed, being drunk all over the place. Anna Nicole Smith just died from addiction, and we all read about it in tabloids and thought, what a loser. Amy Winehouse was dying right in front of us. Like, this was not a cozy time to publish a book about being a drunk mom. But at the same time, I also had a lot of positive feedback. It was not as much as the negative, because there was, this whole sensationalizing of like addiction and motherhood. But it was also really telling what happened when I published, Unshaming 10 years later, when we have on a surface different attitudes about mental health and addiction, etc. And, it's a point of pride for a celebrity to say I'm sober now, where before, remember, like, they all used to go away for exhaustion. Like, everyone was exhausted, but the reality is they were in rehab, right?
Yeah. And now let's pause for a quick word about my other podcast. Since I was a kid, I've loved watching movies. As a psychiatrist, I'm blown away by how film touches us at our core, deepens our self-knowledge, and can improve the human condition. I wanted to let listeners know that I've started a new podcast called Real Mental with Dr. Marcia Sirota. I'm going to be talking with directors, writers, actors, and critics to help people figure out their lives by getting to the truth about mental health on the big and small screen. Some recent films covered are Anora, Amelia Perez, Will and Harper, and The Last Showgirl. Please subscribe to Real Mental on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. I just thought of something as you were talking. I was reflecting back as you were pushing your stroller with your little one
Mm,
and passing these people who were, substance users. And I was thinking how, the actors and the celebrities are wealthy.
yes.
So you can be wealthy and beautiful
Hmm.
and totally addicted.
Yes.
And it's okay because you're wealthy and beautiful.
Hmm.
But if you're poor and you look not so great
Hmm.
and you're out on the streets
Yeah.
with your substance abuse, it's a completely different thing, even though it's exactly the same thing, except with money, without money, with a hairstyle, without a hairstyle. So our judgments are very strange because they're very materialistic. They're
Absolutely.
very much
Yeah.
about status. If you have social status, you can be the biggest substance misuser around and,
Hmm.
fine, oh, poor person has a problem, send them to rehab. If you have no status,
Yeah.
if you're marginalized,
Yeah.
in any way, racialized in any way,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's a bad thing, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I just see how we treat our, indigenous populations. Like there's
Yeah.
still so much stigma. We're very early in the reconciliation years. I mean, it's all looks great on paper and there's a lot of articles and propaganda and stuff, but reality is completely different. Like it's there's still so much judgment and there's all this intergenerational trauma and it's heartbreaking and it's right under our noses and we don't want to see, we don't want to acknowledge it. I think it's an ongoing issue and I don't really have any ideas as to how to solve it. And now you're saying, I'm thinking like we are very surface based too. It's funny I mentioned celebrities because I know that's a point of like everybody can relate and remember these names and these people, but as you said, there's lots of nameless anonymous people who are dying like right on the street outside of our buildings. Like I live in Parkdale, so I'm exposed to people in active addiction daily, and it's horrible.
And especially for you, because, you really see mirroring, right? You see,
Yeah,
like you say there, but for the grace of God, go I, right?
no, that's yeah. And like in 2014, after Drunk Mom came out, I had a column on mental health for Toronto Star. And it was doing really well. Like it was getting a lot of retweets, a lot of readers. Like I came out of the gate with a huge headline that said, "I'm writing this so that I won't die." I didn't come up with the title, but it was about suicide prevention and like, the public image versus private image, lots of stuff about addiction, lots of stuff about family of addicts. And it was the first column that got cut during the budget cuts. And I thought, obviously I was upset on a personal level, but I thought this is really interesting as just a commentary on what we pay attention to and where we invest our money. And I was told by my editor at the time that if I were only to write this column and mention sort of celebrities and focus on that a little bit more, like Prince Harry was doing some mental health stuff, like they were open to having it continue in the form that it was. And that wasn't really useful. Like that was not doing anybody any good, but this is presumably what people wanted to read. But I just thought again, it was so interesting that like the first thing that got caught was mental health. And I'm sure you're very aware of all these frustrations, like how impossible it is for people who don't have money to get a therapist or to get any sort of assistance. And yeah, then I went to the CBC for a minute to write columns there, but it was very similar, right? Like it's like ultimately people don't care. What I'd like now that's happening, and I had to think about it, is that we do have a lot of attention and exposure of like mental health on social media, which I think is both good and bad because I'm sure you see all the language that was like a, therapy speak, like permeating social media. It's like overused, but then there's a lot of sort of normalizing things that are taboo formally. Like I've seen a couple reels on TikTok, young women posting from like my day at CAMH, and this is what I do, and this is when I take my pills. And I think it's good ultimately because it is showing that, it's happening in our society and there's some attention to it. I just yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's a trend or if it's gonna stay or you know better
Yeah.
than I do probably about that.
I think that I don't mind that kind of stuff. I think that my problem comes when people who are not experts
Yeah.
are giving advice
Yes.
or weighing in on things that they really don't understand, and then it's causing harm. And I think That's where I draw the line. I'm happy with people talking about their own experiences. I'm happy with people demystifying experiences and stuff. But I think when you have people who really don't know what they're talking about, giving, all sorts of, advice, and this is how you do something, and this is how you get over something. And then it makes me nervous
Oh
because
yeah.
people take them seriously. They're an influencer, and they're an influencer. So they're supposed to know something, and they don't know anything. And
And I
it's
know firsthand
problematic.
how
Yeah.
that happens because I have been asked in the past to comment on things, publicly that I had no business commenting. I think I was always careful to say I can only speak to my experience, and this is
Yeah.
something that, we're also it's very much encouraged in 12-step meetings. You can't really comment on anybody else. You're not an
Yeah.
expert, and even with my little psychology degree. But I remember being called to a radio show to comment on Rob Ford leaving rehab. And did I think that he was going to stay sober? That was the question. It was a live radio. I remember bringing my toddler, like sitting in a green room and being completely out of it, like 7 a.m. in the morning, commenting on this man's life that I had no business commenting, no expertise commenting. It was probably one of the worst interviews I've ever given because I just froze and I said, I don't know. Like, why are you asking me? I just wrote this memoir about myself, not about Rob Ford. And I have
Yeah, you aren't suddenly an expert on
I
addiction.
didn't do any studies. I have no, it's just, so, I mean, I'm happy to share my experience that I have now after 13 years of hearing from readers. That's fine. But it's still very anecdotal. Like, I don't have longitudinal, group studies done on this. So, but yeah, I think that is harm in that people just, hang aside outside of their door and say, I'm not going to tell you about, attachment theory now. I'm going to make myself expert on it. Or everyone's a narcissist. Like it's just crazy. It's too
Yeah.
much.
The other thing I have a slight problem with as well, not as much of a problem, is how everyone is diagnosing themselves.
Absolutely.
Everyone has a diagnosis. And I think it's, on the one hand, it's great to demystify conditions and, take away the stigma. But as a psychiatrist in practice for decades, I can tell you that diagnosis is hard, really, really hard, because a lot of conditions overlap, a lot of conditions mimic each other. And to really understand a person, you need objectivity, you need expertise, you need experience, and you need time. And these people who don't have the objectivity, they don't have the expertise, they don't have the experience, and they're not taking any time, are giving themselves and each other diagnoses. And that to me is dangerous too. So I have an issue with that. So those are my issues with social media. But I do agree with you that destigmatizing mental conditions is important.
Mm,
And I think the next step is for society in general and the government, politicians to fund mental
yeah.
health. Like I just heard this morning that in Saskatchewan, they're now signing a law to involuntarily treat people with addiction. So you can take an addict off the street
Wow.
and put them involuntarily into rehab and force treatment on them. And of course, you know how well that's going to go. Not.
Yeah. Oh, I haven't heard of that.
Yeah.
That's like, that's a prison. That's called, we're creating a new prison system. So,
Yeah.
and we all know how well that works too. So,
Yeah. So I think, the next step is really funding more mental health, paying mental health practitioners equally to,
mhm,
physical health practitioners, which has not been the case ever.
mhm,
And, funding hospitals for mental health, funding treatment centers, funding recovery centers. Like, for someone to go to 2 weeks or 6 weeks of rehab, it's incredibly expensive. And
there,
so many people can't attend, right? So all these things I think are
yeah,
are so so important, and that comes from having society as a whole appreciating how important
yeah,
mental health is. And even though it's the number 2 cause of workplace disability after back pain,
yeah.
it's just not funded, and that's really shocking to me
Yeah.
still.
I mean, I talk about a little bit like just going back to what you people self-diagnosing, because when I was teaching at university, everyone had ADHD and everyone had like this or that and on an
Yeah.
autism spectrum. And
Yeah.
because people can require academic accommodations, right? To
Mhm.
to write exams later, etc. And yeah, and I thought this is great because we are educating ourselves and we have that out. But also like to your point, there were not enough supports. So even if like I had a student who came in and with the stress, they did have to wait for some time to see a counselor who is usually a student, another student, a bit older, and then I I don't know. I really do hope that we put more money into like everything, like addiction services and recovery. And like I had my own experience with rehab was the first one I had to wait for. I was lucky enough that I had, you know, loving ex-husband and a family that was supporting me. So I could wait 8 weeks, and I waited and I went to rehab pretending that I was researching my novel. The second time, because I went to another rehab, I was in deep distress. I needed help now. Like there was no waiting for beds. And I took out a loan, and it was a big loan, so that I could find a bed. And I thought, I'm taking out a loan. It's literally saving my life. But this person on the street that I just walked by doesn't have, a fucking bank account. Sorry, doesn't have a bank account to be able to take out a loan. So that's really not fair, and it's terrible. And there aren't enough beds. There aren't enough rehab centers. And as you know, a lot of rehab centers are also not legitimate. Similarly with people, pretending to be experts. It's like, oh, I have a rehab center coaching, yoga, spiritual retreat, but no one there has, a degree or any sort of expertise. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So I was thinking about, shame, since our
Yeah.
topic is
Yes.
shame today. And I was thinking about how so many professionals like to keep at arm's length from addiction because they don't want to face their own
Yeah.
tendencies toward addiction, their own woundedness, their own compulsive behaviors. And, a lot of professionals have secret addictions. They might be, workaholics, they might be shopaholics, they might be secretly having too many cocktails, they might be like sexaholics, who knows? They're having their own addictive or compulsive behaviors. And so they push away the person who's suffering because they don't want to see themselves mirrored in that person. You didn't have a problem looking at those people on the street and going,
Hmm.
I see myself in you because you're working on healing your shame.
Hmm.
But a professional who is
Yeah.
terrified of facing their shame
Yeah.
will push that person away and will not be able to support them. And I think our whole society does not want to acknowledge their own woundedness, their own vulnerability. And so we shame the addict so that we don't have to recognize our own
Yeah.
shame, our own vulnerability.
Oh, I absolutely, I agree. And again, I have a small passage in there where I just talk about how, it's like addiction is such an interesting thing too, because we do think of drugs, alcohol, and sex and gambling, etc. But it's really anything that takes you out of your hour, whatever your presence, right? So,
Yeah.
the first guilty party is our phone. Like all the people they're doom scrolling, and you can sit in a room full of people and three people are on the phone. No one's present. No one's having a conversation. No one's paying attention. Yeah. And like, who's going to acknowledge that that's problematic? It's not, because it's acceptable, because we all have phones and we all do it. But it is probably as problematic as being on a computer and gambling and like spending money. It's a very similar mechanism. So,
Yeah. And when people were all smoking,
yeah.
remember, not that long ago, everyone just thought that was perfectly normal and they were all killing themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally true.
So you wrote this book, Drunk Mom. You became a best-selling author, the role model for sobriety, and then you relapsed.
Hmm.
So that must have been a really like a dark night of the soul moment, right? Because you had all these eyes upon you.
Hmm. Hmm.
How did you come out the other side? Like, what were the tools or the things that helped you to
Hmm.
move through that? Because I can imagine that must have been such a painful time for you.
Yeah, I mean, it was, but the thing about pain is it's just like, it's as big as our tolerance, right? And if you kind of push the boundary more and more and more and see how far you can get, and addicts especially have a tendency to do that, and seeing what we can get away with and how we can, you know, exist in this double thing and this double life. But I think it was actually, because obviously I started researching and writing this book when I was sober already, but I have not dealt with this sort of with the shame of it, right? So again, like as I said, trying to find an expert on the topic of shame, finding her within myself was very illuminating, and it was very, I guess it was, trying to find a word, like there was something tender about it and something really caring and safe that I offered to myself, because it was one of those like really authentic times where I didn't judge myself, because I stopped judging myself again on success versus failure. Like, you failed, you made it, you didn't make it, blah, all this stuff. I just thought I'm gonna really look at the wisdom of like continuous learning. And that's where I'm gonna be for the rest of my life, right? Hopefully, like if I'm lucky, the wisdom comes from pain, all that stuff. So I think that there was no specific moment other than, again, what I said, like being able to connect with the little creature. And also, like, what it was kind of a couple of things happened. So I wanted to get sober more actively. So I went back to 12-step meetings, not in person, because in person meetings didn't work for me. I found AA to be one more place of shame, or like finding shame in it, because I thought I can never, like, measure up to these giants of sobriety with their 10-year medallions, etc. But doing it on Zoom and having that sort of, I guess, more of a wall of anonymity too, and thinking myself that I was too public and too exposed really helped. And then having this, helpless creature care for me, and but also being very, as much as I could be open with my son. And I think that was another pivotal thing. And he's old enough now to be able to talk about it. Is that we always had a conversation about like what was going on. It was, I call him my first witness, and witness is someone who just simply witnesses you and is around you, because he was the first one to call me out on my stuff. He was the first one to notice, sometimes because as a child of an addict he's hyper vigilant, so he would point out things that had nothing to do with addiction but were out of ordinary. So like me singing or laughing louder, was a signal for him that there was something off, which was annoying, but I'm like, that's the consequence of my past behavior. But we've always had a very open and very, like, I'm hoping, tolerant relationship. And I asked him recently, because I am working on a book about loved ones of addicts, so not focus on me, but on the people around me or other people who love addicts. And I asked him what it was like to grow up with me. And he said, the best thing about it was that we did have an open conversation about it, and that we had the sort of relationship that allowed it. So it's just a roundabout way of saying that, if someone is struggling with addiction, that there's huge liberation and like freedom in being able to come truthful with someone. And again, that could be therapist or a loved one, and your kid as well, if they can handle it. I don't know if I answered that well, but just sharing yourself, because I mean, the fewer lies you have, the more free you are. And, the more free you are, the less shame you have. So it's all very feeding itself.
Yes, and there are so many things in our lives that can make us feel shame.
Mhm.
Just like you were saying, feeling like a failure, right? Because the expectations on us and the standards
Mm. Yeah.
set up for us are so crazy.
Yeah.
So it's easy to feel that way.
And yeah, no, it's good to realize like who's putting them onto you too, because I have like the pettiest streak ever. And I know I'm very competitive. I don't like saying that I am, but I notice myself comparing and competing, not competing, but comparing a lot. And we all do it, I think. And a lot of the time I have to stop and be like, okay, but who is really comparing? Like, is anybody else comparing, or is it you just like comparing yourself to, again, unrealistic expectations or something that's not even there? I mean, I think we're very, as human beings, adept at finding shame. Even if we have like rid of some of it, we're like, okay, let's bring more. Let's see where else I can, and you mentioned food. Like, I've struggled with body image and things like that. I talk about it in Unshaming a little bit. And like, yeah, body image and how we feel about ourselves and how we look, especially, I don't want to say just as women, because boys are going through this right now with all the looks maxing and all this like pressure on appearing a certain way. Like, we just find it, like we're just so good at it. So yeah, I don't know.
I know it's really, really hard these days
Yeah.
because our world has become so superficial
Yeah.
that, everything is a source potentially of shame. How young we are, how attractive we are, how slender we are, how fit we are, how wealthy we are, how connected we are, et cetera, how many likes we have. And
Sure.
if we can find that, sense of self-worth and just entitlement to happiness just because wow, what a pressure it takes off of us,
Yes.
right? Just to be able to be okay with who we are,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
you know.
And I think people notice too. They do notice when, like, when you're grounded in yourself. Like, I know quite a few people who are just in themselves, in their whole, and they're very, inspiring to be around. So, and yeah, you don't need money for that, or really much. It's all within us, I think.
Well, it's been so much fun talking with you today, and I want to ask you my three final questions. So you sort of started answering the first question, which is what are you up to? So why don't you like give me a little bit more about what are you working on now?
Yeah, so I usually work on 4 or 5 things at a time, and
Wow.
that's the workaholism part. But I mean, it's a good way to divert my obsessive tendencies. So a couple of books, but the one that I'm really excited about, and I think it's going to be a big challenge, but also I think very needed, is a book about people who love addicts. So I'm right now finding people to interview basically to I have someone who's a child of addicts whose parents passed away. I'm going to be talking to my son. It's not focusing on myself, it's more focusing on other people. So because I think we have enough memoirs about me. So that's the big project. And yeah, and other ones are a short novella and then work of commercial fiction. So yeah. And then I really want to start something that, because of conversations like we're having, I would love to do like cross country conversations about mental health, specifically with authors, because I'm close to authors who write or talk about things that are mental health or mental health adjacent. I think it would be just wonderful to do that. So that's in a dream category. But yeah.
That sounds wonderful. And where can people find you if they're interested in learning more about you and your work?
Yeah, I have a website like we all do. So it's just my first and last name all together.com. Not very good at updating it. And I am on Instagram under Jowita Bot. So my first name BOT dot whatever Instagram handle is. And it's a public Instagram. That's where I post stuff about the book and any sort of updating any events. I have an event coming up with Margaret Atwood, whom I haven't met yet. So I'm very excited about that. It's the end of May. And yeah, and then books are in bookstores. I'm a huge supporter of independent bookstores because I know they're struggling against places like Indigo and Amazon. So if you want to get this book, this the newest book, it is at your local independent bookstore. I hope. I think it should be there. Most likely signed because I signed a lot of books. So
Fabulous. And what's your call to action today for the listener? Something that they could think about or put into action?
yeah, maybe I just thought, I don't know, thinking of what unshaming means to them and being able to both see ourselves and see other people and being able to, I think, witness ourselves first of all, but also allowing our others to witness us in a safe space. Because again, I don't want to be like tell everybody, oh, everything that's making you embarrassed or ashamed. But if you feel safe with whether it's a friend or a therapist, especially a therapist, yeah, it's very liberating. I don't know. Someone asked me recently why, like, I guess I seem maybe free or happy or something, and I said, I really there's not a lot that I'm like I have to think about in terms of like, did I tell the truth? Because, addict life is based on lies. It's just lies through and through, secrecy, lies, and hiding. And when you come out of it, the true recovery is that you no longer have to do that. You truly and shamefully. There isn't much that anybody can trip you up on. So,
That's a beautiful way to live.
yeah.
Well, Jowita Bydlowska, thank you so much for coming on the Ruthless Compassion podcast today.
Thank you so much. This was amazing. Thank you. Really wonderful talk.
This is Dr. Marcia Sirota. Thank you for listening. Please leave a review and your comments wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for my free newsletter at marciasirotamd.com, where you'll learn about upcoming online events as well. Also, we love getting referrals from our listeners about future podcast guests. So please email us at info@marciasirotamd.com.